The average family in the bottom 20% of the American income distribution, so our poorest families, they receive about $26,000 a year from the government. But the average family in the top 20%, so our richest families, they receive about $36,000 a year from the government. So of everything I learned in the book, this is the thing that still like really chaps me up, because that's like almost a 40% difference. So we just do a lot more to guard fortunes than we do to fight poverty. And once you learn that, I feel like any time you hear a politician say like, golly, that's such a good idea, but like, how can we afford it? It just drives you nuts, because like, you know, you could afford it if we did a bit more, you know, to fight poverty and a bit less to subsidize the rich.
I'm very excited to welcome you this evening. I'm Rachel Donadio. I'm the curator of cultural programs here, and it's an honor and a pleasure to have Matthew Desmond this evening in conversation with Lauren Collins. They will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from you in the audience. And without further ado, I will introduce both the speakers. Matthew Desmond is Maurice P. Professor of Sociology at Princeton University and founder of the Eviction Lab, which created the first national data set on evictions in America. He's the author of 5 books, including Poverty by America, which he will be discussing tonight, and Evicted. His work, praised by the New Yorker and Esquire, examines why poverty persists in America. Desmond writes for the New York Times Magazine and other outlets. A past MacArthur Fellow, his research focuses on urban sociology, poverty, race, and ethnography. And in conversation with him this evening is Lauren Collins, who began contributing to the New Yorker in 2003 and became a staff writer in 2008. Her subjects have included Michelle Obama, Donatella Versace, the graffiti artist Banksy, Emmanuel Macron, the refugee crisis, and equal pay. Since 2015, she's been based in Paris, covering stories mainly from France. And she is the author of When in French, Love in a Second Language, which the Times named as one of its 100 notable books of 2016. She is working on a second book about a coup d'etat perpetrated by white supremacists in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, and its effects over the past 120 years. Please join me in giving them a big round of applause.
Okay, we're going to start. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. I am absolutely, your book is a call to arms. It is utterly convincing and persuasive, and made me think a lot about how I think every one of you in this room are going to walk out tonight with some ideas about how to combat poverty in the United States, the richest country in history, which has more poverty according to almost all measures than any other advanced democracy. Almost 1 in 9 Americans, you write, live in poverty, even though poverty in America is grossly underreported. And as you point out, Matt, there is plenty of poverty even above the technical poverty line. If Americans living in poverty founded a country, its population would be equal to that of Australia or of Venezuela. So, very simple one-word question, why?
Hey, everyone. Thanks for doing this, Lauren, and thanks for coming out. I think that the short answer is because a lot of Americans benefit from so much poverty. And we benefit in ways that we recognize and ways that we don't recognize. I think we exploit the poor. We continue to be super segregated. We continue to support a welfare state that actually gives the most to people that need it the least. And so I think that that's a both morally fraught answer, but it's also an empowering one, because it means that a lot of us are connected to the problem and also connected to the solution. I think a part of me was just so tired of us like blaming whoever, blaming immigrants or blaming the other political party or putting it on Congress or putting it on the guy that's richer than us, instead of kind of looking at how I'm connected to this issue myself.
Yeah, I mean, you write that a lot of people, looking at poverty in the past are very clear about what it was and how awful it was, and isn't it a good thing, that maybe some of that poverty doesn't exist anymore. But when the conversation comes around to the present, that their language becomes very murky and imprecise.
Yeah, I wonder if you find this writing about history too, where like we're very comfortable saying, oh, back then they were exploiting people, getting over on people, treating people, racist way, and then we're like, but us, we don't, our voices can become kind of very stilted and stunted, and I like think about exploitation, which is a word I don't think we use enough when it comes to the poverty debate. So think of like just financially soaking the poor. So every year, about $11 billion in overdraft fees from banks are charged to poor folks in America. $1.6 billion in check cashing fees, almost $10 billion in payday loan fees. So that's like $61 million in fines and fees charged to poor folks like every single day in America. So who benefits from that, right? And so the banks and payday lending industry benefits from that, sure, but like a lot of us that have free checking accounts also benefit because those accounts aren't free. They're subsidized by billions of dollars, charged to basically 9% of bank clients. And so I think those moves, those change in perspectives, for me, I think really matter for how we talk about and consider the causes and solutions to poverty.
Right. I mean, you write a lot about how we tend to focus on labor exploitation, right? But there's a lot of consumer exploitation going on that leads to poverty, reinforces poverty, intensifies poverty. That was a perspective shift that helped a lot in reading your book. So this is a book about poverty that, in many ways, if I read it correctly, is addressed to the rich, or at least to the financially secure part of the American population. Can you tell us about the genesis of the project and about its intended audience, about who you want to reach, who you've been trying to reach with this book and with all the work and all the education in a way that you've done around it?
So the genesis was the book I wrote before this was called Evicted, and I lived in really poor neighborhoods in Milwaukee. I lived in a mobile home park, and I lived in a rooming house in the inner city. And I followed people getting evicted, and I spent time with them and their landlords, and wrote about the human cost of the housing crisis. So it was like a reporting project on the ground. And so I set out to do another book like that. And it was a book that required like access to a state institution that was really hard to get access to. And so it took me like 5 years to get access to it, and I finally got access to it. And then COVID hit. And my university was like, you can't do this anymore. They pulled us all home. And so I was sitting at home during the pandemic, and I was like, all right, if someone stopped me on the street and they're like, all right, Desmond, why is there so much poverty in America, and what can we do about it? What's my answer? And I was like, I don't think I had an answer, And so it was like, Toni Morrison said she wrote the novel she wanted to read, and I think that there was something to that about, I kind of had to get this out of my system. And the book is written to like the comfortable American. And I think that's a really tricky audience thing to do in a book for a few reasons. So the book uses a lot of we language, like a lot of us language, but the us is really about the lucky, the comfortable, the privileged. And I thought that using that we language would like sell my poor readers short, like they would feel cut out of the audience. That just hasn't been the case. The thing that's also like tricky on the other side is people like, do they write themselves into that we or not? Because there's always like a guy that's way richer than you are. And
that that can shift over the course of a lifetime or of a career.
Yeah.
Can you tell the people who are here tonight a little bit about your own relationship to poverty, about your own, you come at this with some personal experience too, right?
So I grew up in Winslow, Arizona, which is in an Eagles song. And
can you sing it? No.
Yeah, like a certain generation of person is like yes, and so my dad was a preacher, and we never had much money.
Can I just have a very trivial question, but I've been so curious. I've listened to some interviews you've done. What kind of preacher was he? What church was he in?
He was a non-denominational preacher in Arizona. So that's basically a Baptist minister. So that's a conservative evangelical household. That's what that is. And so money was always tight, and we got our gas shut off often. And then the bank finally took our home before it was all the rage. And when that happened, I was like a sophomore, junior in college, and I went to college on loans and scholarships, and I think I was just embarrassed. And
were you still living at home then, or
no? I was in the dorm. I went home and helped my parents pack up and move, and but I think part of me asked, like, why is this how the country handles when it finally falls on hard times? And so kind of went to college really upset about poverty, angry about it. And so when I wasn't working, I was spending a lot of time either in the library or hanging out with homeless folks around my university. Not serving them soup or anything, just like hanging out with them, trying to figure out the country. So. And
was it apparent to you from the start that academia, that sociology would be the way to engage with these questions about poverty that were starting to bubble up for you?
No, I was just like lost, I think. Like I was just trying to figure this out. I thought I might want to be a lawyer. Law felt too constricting. I knew I could write okay. Like I think somewhere along the way, like professors were like, "You write okay," And so, I applied. I applied to the top 3 sociology programs. I got into one of them. That's where I went, It was very it was all like kind of luck and happenstance, yeah.
Okay, well, since we are not going to, we're not going to use murky and imprecise language tonight. Explain to us why the rich are the biggest dependents of the American welfare state.
Okay, so if you think about what a welfare state is, often we think about things that are flowing to poor folks, like cash welfare, housing assistance, Medicaid, things like that in America, food stamps. But that's not just a welfare state. The welfare state's also social insurance programs, so that's like social security in America, which a lot of folks take, even folks that are very secure. But you got to also count tax breaks, because they put money in my pocket and they cost the government something. So in America, we get a tax break for our mortgages. If we have a mortgage on our house, it's called the mortgage interest deduction. In a couple years, it will cost the country about $100 billion a year. So it's a big benefit. So if I'm a homeowner, I could get that benefit by the government issuing me a check, or I could get it by deducting my tax burden. It's the same accounting difference. So we spend about $1.8 trillion in America on tax breaks for like everything. So mortgages, retirements, college savings funds, you name it, which is just far more money than we spend on direct housing assistance or any kind of assistance to the needy. So if you add up everything our government does for us, all those programs that flow to the very bottom, those tax breaks, those social insurance programs, the average family in the bottom 20% of the American income distribution, so our poorest families, they receive about $26,000 a year from the government. But the average family in the top 20%, so our richest families, they receive about $36,000 a year from the government. So of everything I learned in the book, this is the thing that still like really chaps me up, because that's like almost a 40% difference. So we just do a lot more to guard fortunes than we do to fight poverty. And once you learn that, I feel like any time you hear a politician say like, golly, that's such a good idea, but like, how can we afford it? It just drives you nuts, because like, you could afford it if we did a bit more, to fight poverty and a bit less to subsidize the rich.
The way I read the book, it's also fundamentally a book about complacency, about this widespread acceptance of poverty and people weighing these things up and making choices and saying, well, we don't want to have higher prices for everybody. We don't want to risk having higher prices for everybody. So let's just accept in perpetuity that, we'll have some people in poverty. And you write, that it doesn't have to be that way. But this widespread acceptance of poverty, this complacency, do you think there's something fundamentally American, particularly American, about this problem?
Yeah, I do. And I think this is like a question we're just not talking about a lot in America. Journalists aren't writing about it a lot. Like there's this sense in America that everyone's kind of struggling. And there is a lot of struggle in America, right? Like a third of the country lives in homes making $55,000 or less. So there's a ton of economic insecurity in America. but there's just so much wealth, right? So like in COVID, we bought like 300,000 power boats. Just, that's a lot of power boats.
That we is doing some work
yeah,
there.
so I didn't buy a power boat, but like my country people did. You know, we spend billions of dollars every year on our pets. Like, you know, the Christmas tree industry is $1 billion industry. You know, it's just like the country's...
No, it's not even just the Christmas tree. It's Halloween blow up. I mean, yeah.
And so, like, I think that, you know, just coming to terms with that kind of idea that the country does... 1 in 8 Americans have a second home. You know, that even a timeshare, like, that's a lot of us. And so coming to terms with, there's so much of that, not just security, but massively world historic luxury in America is something that a lot of us aren't talking about. We did talk about right before the financial crash. You might remember, like, the New York Times Magazine ran this cover, and it was like the new Gilded Age, and it had like a manhole cover that was like gold plated. And then like the crash hit, and then we just stopped talking about that altogether. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because the past 50 years, you write, have been 50 years of nothing as far as poverty is concerned. But one of the most surprising findings, and I think this was surprising even to you, is that it's not necessarily for lack of trying. Why has the poverty rate remained steady even as government spending on poverty has doubled?
So there's a lot of ways to measure poverty. Measuring poverty is very hard, and smart people disagree on this characterization. But I believe it's true. So if you look
I have to interrupt you just for a second for people who haven't read the book to say my jaw hit the ground reading that people in prisons, people in mental institutions, and maybe there are some other
homeless shelters,
flagrant exceptions, but those people are not counted in measures of poverty, which it means just seems inconceivable to me.
Right.
But just, you know, I wanted everybody in the audience tonight to know that because that was a huge takeaway for me, just learning how underreported poverty is, even though the rates are already shocking.
Yeah. And a lot of Americans also just think like, so the poverty line, the official poverty line for a single person in America is about $15,000 a year. And for a family of 4, it's about $33,000 a year. So if you ask most Americans, like, what do you need to make it in America? They say $80,000 a year. So even like thinking of the poverty line, most of us think it's way too low anyways. But if you look at the poverty rate, and according to different measures of the poverty rate, it's very stable across 50 years since we started measuring it since the War on Poverty. And this is really frustrating because anti-poverty spending has gone up. It's gone up a lot per capita. So anti-poverty spending on the 13th biggest, what we call means-tested programs, the biggest anti-poverty programs, went from about $1,000 a person the first year Reagan was elected to about $3,400 a person the first year Trump was elected the first time. So that's a 237% increase adjusting for inflation. So the country hasn't got stingy over time. The opposite is true. So even if we want to debate about the poverty rate, which is a statistical measure, like there's still like very clear indicators that things are going bad. That no one, you don't need a PhD in sociology to understand. Like, you know, so eviction filings are up 21% since 2000. The share of Americans going to food pantries is up 19% since 2000. The number of public school kids that are homeless is up 74% since the Great Recession. So like, that's not good. And so what's going on, right? What's going on? And when the War on Poverty and Great Society were launched, one of the things that's going on is like, the labor market isn't pulling its weight, right? So 1964 and 1965, a third of the American workforce belonged to a union. Wages were climbing like 2% every year. So we weren't fighting poverty alone. The market was delivering for workers, even workers at the bottom of the pay scale. But as unions lost power, our jobs got a lot worse. So one sociologist puts it like this, like our grandparents had careers and our parents had jobs and we complete tasks. And that's kind of the slide of the working class in America. And this is one reason, you know, we have so much poverty in America.
And then, you know, the government aid that is being extended isn't necessarily getting to people who need it, right?
Right.
Like, so why, you know, why is the American welfare state this leaky bucket, and how can we fix it?
So there's a leaky bucket problem, and then there's a people avoiding welfare problem. So the leaky bucket problem is $1 in the budget doesn't mean $1 in someone's hand. So when I was living in Milwaukee, my roommate, his name was Wu. He was a security guard. He worked all the time, but not in a job that like pays you above the counter. You guys have that phrase here? Like a legitimate job. He got paid in cash. And so our rooming house was really run down. He stepped on a nail. His foot got infected, and then he had diabetes, and the infection accelerated, and the doctor decided to take his leg before the infection took all of him. So I met Wu in the hospital, and he's got one leg now, and we had a good cry, and then I helped him apply for disability. But it just got turned down. His application just got rejected. And Wu just was like, this is how it always is. As if getting rejected is part of the application process. And so he hired a lawyer, and the lawyer working on contingency can receive like 25% of the funds their clients received when they were waiting. And that's what happened to Wu. Like the lawyer helped him get on disability. Wu got like a check for like $2,400 or something. He bought a wheelchair accessible van that like blew up in a few years. And his lawyer took him $400. So I started looking into this. I was like, how much do lawyers all across America get paid? And every year in America, $1 billion in Social Security funds doesn't go to people like Wu. It goes to lawyers to help people like Wu get on disability. So that's how the welfare state's a leaky bucket. That's problem number one. And then problem number two is like welfare avoidance, which is like the opposite of welfare dependency, which is what we talk about all the time in America, right? They're like, we're paying people to stay home. People are dependent on these things. They're not working. But there's not a ton of evidence for welfare dependency, actually. There's a ton of evidence for welfare avoidance. The fact that like billions and billions of dollars are left on the table every year because people qualify for aid but deny themselves that aid.
And what are the reasons that people avoid welfare?
We used to think it was shame. So we used to think people were too proud. So back in the day, like food stamps were stamps, right? Your mom would have to do this like shame ritual at the grocery store, and she would like tell you to go sit in the car, and so we changed food stamps to like an EBT card, so it looks like a Visa card. Do you know what happened to food stamp rates? Nothing. It wasn't like a bunch of Americans were sitting at home being like, I'm really hungry, but like I'll be embarrassed at the grocery store. So stigma plays some role in it, but it plays a lot less of a role than just straight up red tape and pain in the buttness.
So even an innovation as seemingly trivial as like changing a font.
Yeah,
changing can have effect. I mean,
right.
Can you talk about that a little bit, or just give one of these examples?
Yeah. It's like marketing, right? It's like, why don't we market our welfare state, right? And like, if we could do one great thing in America, it's market shit to people and get stuff to people, right?
We're good at that.
We are so good at that. Like, I can order anything right now on my phone. And why can't it be that easy for a mom who has a newborn baby to get some formula, for me to get like mouthwash immediately, from some warehouse in Jersey. And so I think that, if you change the font, if you do a mailer to elderly Americans and say, call this number, you probably qualify for food stamps. And when you call the number, like a human picks up and spends like 20 minutes on the phone, big increase in take-up rates. So, there is really we're having a very strange conversation now in America about government efficiency. But there is these huge efficiency problems in America that we need technological fixes for.
Okay, so if you were the Doge or what would you do? How would you make the delivery of aid to people who need it more efficient?
I would change the culture of government institutions so you're incentivized to deliver to people, not to not break rules. So a lot of the government bureaucrats, they're doing this historic, amazing work, but they advance in their careers by not messing up. Right? So it's not that like, I found this way to deliver for 100 more people this year. It's like, I didn't have any violations. And when you develop that kind of culture and this kind of like weighing these kind of programs down so much, you can have a really clunky, inefficient welfare state, not by design. Like, you're not trying to do this. It's just the result of this kind of government culture. So on the culture end, I would do that. And then on the revenue side of things, I would make sure rich people pay their taxes and use that to kind of fill holes in our welfare state that are totally fillable.
And what about this TAMF problem? Is that right? What's the T for? Assistance to Needy Families, but I'm missing the T.
We're doing welfare acronyms tonight. That's what you guys came out for.
We're going to do a little game show. You have to
right.
What is the T?
Right,
What's the T?
Temporary.
Temporary. Thank you. Talk about that a little bit. I mean, this idea that for every dollar that the states are sitting on these kind of discretionary funds that often don't even get used. That was new to me, and I think, Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So when Bill Clinton reformed cash welfare in America, he made it a block grant. And a block grant is just a really wonky, and now it's called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, TANF. And so a block grant is a wonky way of saying the federal government says, here, Alabama, or here, California, here's a pot of money. You've got some discretion about how to use it. It's actually illegal for federal oversight in TANF funds. The federal government can't even audit states. And so when we do that, states have used the money for all sorts of things that aren't related to helping families with kids. So, some states have used the money for Christian summer camps or abortion education, or just not used it at all. Like Tennessee, the last time I checked, was sitting on over $700 million in unused funds. It has the 5th highest poverty rate in the country. So for every dollar that the government gives a state in TANF dollars, only 22 cents go to a family. And this isn't just a red state problem either. Hawaii is sitting on so much unspent TANF funds, they can give every poor kid in their country, in their state, $10,000.
That is shocking. I mean, that's part of the reason that government spending has increased and the poverty rate has remained steady. Yeah. But so COVID was an exception to this, right? Major strides made very quickly in putting a dent in that seemingly immovable rate. Can you talk about what happened during COVID and also why that, in the end was a huge missed opportunity?
Yeah, so COVID had 3 rescue bills, 2 under Trump and the last one under Biden. The last one under Biden was called the American Rescue Plan, and it was the biggest thing the country's done for poor people since the war on poverty. So it took a tax credit called the child tax credit, and it did this to it. It was like a little tweaks, few tweaks. But one thing it did, it made it reach the very bottom of the income distribution, and that basically reduced child poverty by 46% in 6 months.
And you're saying there had not been significant reduction over 50 years until that happened.
It was a massive, massive intervention. So almost cutting poverty in half among kids in 6 months. We reduced the eviction rate to the lowest it's ever been on record by just bailing tenants out with $46 billion from HUD, which is doubling HUD's budget. So it's this massive, deep intervention into poverty. And so there are a few big lessons out of that. One is and this sounds like a silly thing to say in France, but in America, you have to say it. When the government wants to get serious about reducing poverty, it can make big differences. So that was a huge lesson in COVID. But the lesson, I think, for progressives or the left in America is where were we at? What did we say about this? Did we celebrate this? Did we say we want this to be our new normal? Because I heard a lot of silence, and a lot of quiet. We're really good at complaining on the left, and we're really good at criticizing. But when it comes to say this is an amazing thing, we want more of this, we kind of lose our language a bit. And so I think that in our silence, 5 million more kids were cast into poverty. And yes, we can count, we got pretty close. We were a West Virginia senator vote away from making that permanent. But I kind of don't want to put it on Congress. I want us to have some ownership too as a citizen. Yeah.
Well, you say, I've heard you say that Congress should have been terrified of clawing back that money after, this historic intervention.
Right.
So why weren't they? Was it actually not popular with people? Is it because of the kind of, is there a culture of protest that's lacking in America? Like, why was it so easy for them, to pull the hand back after extending it? And, why weren't they terrified? Why?
Yeah. I mean, maybe this is... Maybe we're paying the cost now politically for that in America, I mean, when we talk about what happened with the last election, we're often talking about the inflationary crisis and the Democrats running a really weak candidate. But it's also true that the Democrats delivered really big one time. And then it went away, and maybe the American people lost some faith and lost some steam in that. Maybe if the Democrats had been able to get that over the line, the outcome would be different or much more complicated than it was.
Okay, but so, I mean, do you essentially see it as a failure of communication, of not saying, like,
I don't know.
Or do you think, was it unpopular?
Yeah.
Were there polls? I mean, what does the data say about how people, or if there is data, how did people feel about it who had this money in their pockets? Like, did they miss it when it was gone?
Yeah. But they also I remember meeting with Democratic senators a few weeks after this happened, or a few months after this happened, and they just felt like they didn't get their flowers, that they didn't receive political feedback in a way. And I don't think it was necessarily the fault of the family that received the check and spent it on recovering COVID debt or getting more stable or buying a new car or something like that. I think it was more the fault of the American talking class not helping, us as a people recognize this is something that we could establish permanently. So I don't know, it just didn't catch in the culture in a way that other things have.
I want to I'm going to swerve a little bit, but I want to make sure that we get this in before it's time for questions. How does access to reproductive freedom factor into poverty?
So I know this is like an embarrassing, it's not a confession. This is a thing when I tell people, they don't believe me. But you would go to poverty conferences and you would talk to everyone in America who's basically on the cutting edge of this problem. And this just was not a conversation that was being had.
Because it's taboo?
It's not just due. It's just not
no, why?
No, it's just not a conversation that a lot of us have had, and I think the fall of Roe changed that, massively changed that. And, I visited an abortion clinic for the first time right before the fall of Roe in Philadelphia, just to kind of get my hands around it, because I'd never, I'd spent a lot of time in poor places, but I'd never been to an abortion clinic. And the waiting room to abortion clinic, it just looks a lot like the waiting room to eviction court, or, a lot of poor folks in there. There was this amazing study called the Turnaway Study, where a demographer followed women who went sought abortions that were right above the gestational cutoff and below it. So it was kind of like comparing people right at the same stage, but who had access to abortion or not, and followed them and their kids if they had kids for years. And what they found is folks denied abortions, their kids grew up in poverty a lot more. The women who had access to abortion and then went on to have kids later, their kids did a lot better, and so, that connection is really powerful. Connecting folks to top-line contraception too is it's like this low-hanging fruit that I think a lot of states don't do. Delaware had this amazing program where when a woman hit the healthcare system, wherever, and they would ask as a part of the screening.
Meaning if you came in for a broken leg.
Yeah, broken leg, a fever, annual checkup, whatever. They would, as part of the screening, they would say, you want to get pregnant this year? And if you said no, they'd say, would you like access to all this contraception? And they would try to have you leave that day with whatever you wanted, including nothing. If you didn't want nothing, that's fine. And that dropped unwanted pregnancies in Delaware by 22% that year. So, these really powerful interventions, but we're not doing it.
What about the interplay between poverty and race? Segregated schools, segregated neighborhoods, exclusionary zoning.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so segregation remains a core cause of poverty in America. On most residential land, it's illegal to build anything other than a single detached family home. This is a very strange way to design a civilization. And this continues to be something that really tracks terribly along racial lines. And when we build these communities that are often white, that are areas of concentrated affluence, and we hoard affluence behind our walls, there's a side effect. There's concentrated poverty outside of our walls. And so this is something where like Democrats are more likely to support affordable housing in the abstract, but no more likely to support it in their own neighborhoods. So there was this amazing study that showed that, Republican renters, conservative renters, were more likely to say yes for an apartment in their own backyards that was affordable than liberal homeowners.
So part of your call is like tear down the walls.
We have to tear down those walls.
How do people do that concretely?
So in New Jersey, where I live, the best state, it's the best place outside of Paris. We have a state.
Questions are coming.
No, so we have a state. It's like it's a clear fact. We have a state law, and the state law says, look, every community in New Jersey has to do its fair share of affordable housing. And if you do not build your fair share, courts can redraw your zoning laws. So cities have a real incentive to get serious about it, which is why New Jersey has affordable housing in basically every community in the state, because it has this strong law. So there's policies like that we can implement, but the book never wants to just end there. The book always is trying to implicate the reader in the story. And so what happens is there's these zoning meetings in America, and people go to them. Those people do not reflect the broader community. The people are usually richer and whiter and older than the surrounding community, and they yell at the alderman. Then they gum up the process, and they kill affordable housing everywhere. And so for those of us seeking a different kind of community, a more open, inclusive community, the book asks us to show up at those meetings and stand up and be like, look, I'm not going to use the same arguments my grandfather used. I'm not going to underwrite this community's tradition of segregation. We got to build this thing. So I think that, segregation, poverty, inequality, these things are reproduced in history and law and policy, but they're also reproduced like in backyard barbecues and soccer games and standing in the line at the grocery store. And I think that like drawing us to those moments, I think, is a way to build something like a different kind of norm in America around this.
You wrote this book during COVID.
Yeah.
Under a very different set of circumstances. What do you foresee? Like what's coming down the pike for poverty under the Trump administration? Well, I'll leave it there.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to answer this question in a basic way. I think the normal way to answer it is like, it's really scary and it's going to be terrible. But it was really scary under Biden, and it was really scary under Obama for people below the poverty line. It's not like the poverty line drops drastically under Democratic leadership and increases under Republican leadership. So there's not a comfort in studying poverty.
Is the major change lack of access to reproductive freedom under this particular administration?
There's a million changes. Like, the National Labor Relations Board is basically dead for 4 years. Any cuts that we see for a rebalancing of the tax code, the tax law, is going to be borne by the poor. I don't see a way Congress can pass the law that they just passed to find, all these spending cuts without cutting Medicaid. So like Medicaid funds 40% of all births in America right now. It funds 8 out of 10 poor kids. It funds like most kids with special need disabilities are on Medicaid. Those are going to be the losers under Trump administration. It's going to cut the budget for affordable housing by 50%. Only 1 in 4 families who qualify for any kind of housing assistance in America receive it. So all those losses are going to be borne. But I also this is an old problem that's going to be exacerbated in the Trump administration. But it's something that also, progressives need to get more serious about as well.
Right. Well, here's my final question, because I know that you all are bursting with questions to ask Matt. So you've said that liberals have this despondency problem. that they're better, better in the language of grievance than in the language of repair or celebration. So what is the single most effective thing that people sitting here in this room tonight can do to try to help to alleviate poverty?
Yeah, I don't know where this room lives. If this room lives here, I feel a little unsteady answering that question.
Well, pretend we're just regular Americans.
Yeah. All right. So I think that there's a lot of things we can do. I think we can shop and invest differently. In America, we often think about, I don't want my investment dollars to go to like polluting companies or weapons manufacturing. But we don't think about that at all when it comes to like exploitative companies. In London, I don't know if you guys have this here. In London, the shops have these stickers that are like, this store pays a living wage. And like we in America have a lot of stickers now, but we do not have that sticker. And so like thinking about actually shopping with our wallets, I think thinking about taxes differently really matters.
Can I just, a quick question on the shopping with our wallets. Does that have an impact at the individual level, or does it have to be organized in some way? And are there campaigns that are looking to make, are there boycott campaigns? Is there a way to make that impact collectively felt?
Yeah, the individual level action really matters.
I'm so interested in that.
Yeah.
So make a case for that.
Yeah, I mean, so there are collective organizations like Union Plus that tries to get you to buy union-made products, or B Corp, which tries to get you to shop at organizations that are treating the world and their workers really well. And I think that the more of us that becomes normalized and part of the thing we talk about and part of the identity that we like project, I think it really matters, like changing the status quo. I think that liberals often are like, it's got to be structural change, but have no clear story about how to get that structural change. And one of the ways we get it is by putting a little skin in the game, and talking about this with our neighbors and our friends and family members. So here's the thing that I do with taxes. So I qualify for the mortgage deduction. I am a homeowner in America. I think this tax deduction is indefensible, right? And so that's a moral situation that you're in, right? And so a lot of folks on the left are like, I would totally vote to get rid of this thing. But since I get it, I'm like a dumbass if I don't take it, right? Like that's the conversation. But I don't know, so we take the mortgage deduction and then we give it away, like we give away what we get to our homeless shelter, and then we write our congressperson saying we don't want this for families like us. And I think the more of us do that, the more of us, instead of having that normal conversation in America about taxes, which is like, oh, I gotta pay taxes, be like, yes, look at my house. I get a benefit for this house. And we have like 1 million public school kids that are homeless. That's ridiculous to me. So this is what I did. And I think the more of us that are having those conversations all along the fences, the more it kind of changes the common sense of poverty in America. So I think we can do that. And we can join anti-poverty organizations, which are like really fun, exciting, joyful places to be in America. One of the things that is interesting to me is like, one of the receptions of the book has been like, I'm totally with you, but, and like what comes after the but is like all sorts of random stuff. Like people will be like, but my uncle would hate you, or, but Congress, or, but it's hopeless. And I feel like that sense of hopelessness is just so useless. And folks that are battling poverty on the ground, that are in the trenches, that are doing eviction blockades, that kind of stuff, they are not hopeless because they've had a lot of wins. And so I think that that's just another place we can get plugged into if we wanted to.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren.
So much for the conversation. We're going to open the floor up to all of you.
Questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've got to say, this is one of the most powerful, inspiring talks I've ever heard at the library, and I've been coming here 9 years, so first compliments to both of you. I thought it was fantastic. So my question is, you told a story about the American Rescue Plan, and I think that's a just kind of a symbol of what we can actually do through politics. You can make immediate and life-changing, positive life-changing things in people's lives. But I'm wondering, when you lived with people who were more impoverished and challenging living conditions, why it seems to me that people who are in poverty don't vote. Have you had those conversations? Because it seems to me if we can mobilize that type of action, that maybe we can start to make a dent in our political system and we can get more things like the American Poverty Act.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of folks that are below the poverty line are expressing politics in ways other than voting. So they're a lot more likely to be engaged in direct action, for example. They're actually more likely to sign petitions. Like, they're engaged in these other political actions other than the voting booth. I do think that there is a withdrawal and nihilism in some parts of America among poor folks that really haven't seen a lot of action in a serious way from either political party. This is not to conflate the parties. Like, the Democratic Party clearly is doing more to fight poverty and inequality than the Republican Party right now. But it's not doing enough, I think, to mobilize folks at the very bottom. So I think that's an issue. I also think that, like, voter registration laws and defranchising people it's a real problem in America. So last time I was in Tennessee, someone told me, like, this isn't a red state. This is a disenfranchised state. And so, requiring multiple forms of ID, closing polling stations, closing them early in the day. These are things that are really disadvantaging poor and non-white communities to get them to the voting booth too.
Someone else?
Hello. You can hear me. I would like to get your impression about this. I think that a lot of America was founded on the belief that religious people or good people are going to be wealthy. God is going to provide for the good. And if you're not religious, you're not doing what you're supposed to, you're going to be poor. And I think during the rescue plan situation, even that name, rescuing, we're saving you, we're doing something, somehow it was your fault, but we're going to save you. I think a lot of the poor people who got this, a lot of the people with children, for example, felt, this is something that, that normally I shouldn't get. And I'm not going to tell my congressman, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm just going to quietly take it. I'm getting something beyond what I really should get. And a lot of the rich people were thinking, this is not normal. We shouldn't be giving money to reduce poverty. This is beyond what we should do. This is not our purpose in life, is to reduce poverty. Our purpose in life is to have everybody work as hard as they can. If they're good, then they'll be rich. If they're bad, then they won't. I don't know, what's your opinion?
This is kind of a hot take on that, but I feel that idea is dying in America. And I feel that the data suggests it's dying. So most Democrats and most Republicans now believe that minimum wage is too low. Most Democrats and most Republicans now think the rich aren't paying their fair share of taxes. Most folks on the left and the right think that poverty is a structural problem in America, not an individual problem. That's interesting. That's like something's changing, but like it's our job to create a new story in that vacuum. It's kind of like that old line by Gramsci where like the old is dying and the new hasn't been born yet. I feel like we're in that space in America. This is not to deny the power of those stories, but I really think they are stories and not beliefs. And so, like I remember when we first got pregnant, my wife and I, and people would just tell us stuff. And then pretty soon you were like, oh, they don't believe it. That's just a thing that they say when they realize someone's expecting like a baby, And I feel like that's what happens in America. You'll start a conversation about poverty and people say, well, people should just work harder. And then you just say, all right, let me tell you a story. Here's a story. Here's a story about my friend Julio Paez. This is what his day's like. He wakes up at 10 p.m. He starts work at 10 p.m. He works overnight till 6 a.m. at McDonald's. He rests 2 hours. He checks in at Aerotech, going anywhere the temp service sends him between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. He sleeps as much as he could and is back to McDonald's. Should he work harder? And so I think that I think when you scratch those ideas, those stories, they fall apart really quick. But it's our job to create a new story in that space. So.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm wondering, here we are in Europe, in France, and is there things that the Europeans can teach Americans to address poverty, in your opinion, or are they radically different systems? Or is Europe declining and becoming more like the U.S.?
I think that second one is more in Lauren's wheelhouse, and not my wheelhouse, and I'll leave you to that one.
No, but this is not remotely my wheelhouse, but we had an interesting conversation before coming on, actually, because I had read the book, I'd gotten curious about France and looked up the poverty rate, which is reported at 14.4% in France. So 9 million people living in poverty in France as it's measured in this country. But what Matt and I were talking about is that it's apples and oranges. It's really different for a variety of factors, right? To compare poverty rates, across countries. I can't go any further than that. I am not a specialist in this area, but tell me what you were telling me when we tried to talk about this before.
Yeah, well, the economist John Kenneth Galbraith has this phrase, private opulence and public squalor. And he used it to describe a force in America that I think is accentuated since he wrote in the 1950s and 60s. So private opulence, public squalor is like, I can buy a $3 million, I can't, but someone can buy a $3 million condo in New York City, and they step out in the street, and it feels a lot different than the streets in Paris do, right? And our subway system is a lot different than the metro. And our public parks look a lot different than your public parks do. Because as we've disinvested from the public resource and got more individually wealthy, the public suffers and everyone pays a price for that. And so I think that one of the things that's very different when you come to France or Germany or the Netherlands is that there is a different bargain between private opulence and public poverty. And I think you have, I don't know if you'd say public opulence, but you have deep investments in the public, and everyone benefits from that. And I think that that's a different bargain than we have. So we can buy, our cars are much bigger and nicer than your cars, and our traffic is terrible, and our subway systems are terrible, and our public infrastructure is crumbling. And so I think that that's a tension. So when I go to like Lagos in Nigeria, for example, that looks like an extenuation of private opulence and public squalor in a way, and America is more like in that bargain, I think, in that line. So I think that the Europeans can teach a lot to us, and I think one is like all the benefits you reap when you are investing in the public in a way that, the book tries to make an argument that this isn't just the right thing to do or a good thing to do for all those Americans suffering below the poverty line, but this is a good thing to do for all of us. And this is one of the big reasons. Now, often I get talking to from Europeans though. Like the last time I was in the Netherlands, I got this tour by two sociologists, and we went around, and they're like, "It's not all sunshine and rainbows here, buddy." So I want to temper my enthusiasm, but I got to say, like, you go to Cleveland or Philadelphia, it's very, very different.
Just to follow up on that. Of course, in France, the basic, you began your talk by saying that the wealthiest benefit the most from the transfer of federal funds, right? And that's, I think, probably one of the most important messages from your book, and it's very clearly true. That's also true in France. Many years ago, I was part of a study that was looking at the discrepancy of spending, so state spending here in France, for public universities that were the elite universities, the so-called grande école, compared to regular universities. This study was never published and was never rendered public, but it was clear that the ratio, even within the area of higher education, it was something like 10 times more money was being spent on people who were going to the public elite institutions compared to the public, non-elite institutions. So certainly in France, we have many of the same types of problems. It's just less extreme, right? And the way in which everyone benefits from the system here has allowed there to be a certain kind of compromise, which is also due to all sorts of other factors. But what's really interesting about what you're saying, I think, is there's something uniquely bad about the way this plays out in the States. And I'm trying to get a sense of why is it more extreme there? What is the factor? Because if we understood that better, it would be possibly easier to build more consensus, especially among those people who I think who are not really, who are benefiting from all the things you talked about before, who are supportive, the center-left people who should be making more of a difference in this conversation, and they're not. So what is the uniquely American? I mean, all the things you said, I believe, are certainly true, but why does it play out in this very, very destructive way?
So I wrote an essay for the 1619 Project that the Times put out a few years ago on capitalism. And, the American capitalist system is really founded on slavery. And that gets into our system in deep, deep ways. And I think that we're still living in many ways with that legacy. And look, America's trying to do something different, right? We're trying to have a multiracial democracy. I heard one writer put it like this about the Northern European states. It's easy to have a welfare state when everyone looks like your cousin. And when we have these deep racial divides in America today, that still really matters. For example, you'd survey the American people, and most Americans were for the Affordable Care Act, but against Obamacare, right? It's the same thing, right? But Obamacare is coded black, and so you get that anti-black bias in there. And so I think when that gets into it, it really does hinder our ability to, and that hurts poor black kids, of course, but it also hurts a lot of poor white kids, too.